ethnic stereotypes, national stereotypes, or national character, or racial stereotypes, is a system of beliefs about typical characteristics of members of a given ethnic group or nationality, their status, society, and cultural norms. Thank you guys. Again, good morning. This is Pastor Sean coming to you live with another episode of Death Church Radio Podcast, and the Sean C Stucki Show on BitChute and also Facebook. And haven't actually done one of these psychological lectures, but I wanted to go over this, being that in my class, after taking a test yesterday, I got this question wrong several times on the test, and I'm not exactly sure why. So we're going to be doing a 1 hour breakdown on ethnic and national stereotypes from 3 different sources. One, you guys obviously know what it is, Wikipedia for the first one. That's what we all like to use on the psychology and theology meme pages. So just like to say thank you to the Arminianism Descent from Calvinist Reformed Theology group page for allowing me to host this private lecture. So here's the thing, before we get into it, I just wanted to make this my first exploration video that I've done in a long time. If you guys have followed my channel on BitChute and also YouTube and Facebook, you guys know I've just been doing a lot of videos lately where I just talk in front of the camera about different topics of whatever. But I felt that it was good. It'd be a good time to come back for this week for an exploration series on this subject, being that I'm currently enrolled in Yale right now for Introduction to Psychology. My goal at the end of this is to become a clinical psychologist. But the thing is that when taking the test after going through lecture 6 from, his name is Dr. Bloom, I was not able to get it correct, but it's more of a thing of when you're answering the questions of what do they want you to put as the right answer, not what is the closest to the truth kind of thing. So let's go ahead and get started, and I'll do breakdowns, and I'm going to chime in random parts of this. I took 2 references, one from the Psychology Administration, it's called the APA. There was another one from a website where I did get the name of the quote-unquote journalist that wrote about ethnic stereotypes, and also the Wikipedia entry just for basics, okay? So national stereotypes may be either about one's own ethnicity / nationality, or about a foreign or differing nationality or ethnicity. Stereotypes about one's own nation may aid in maintaining a national identity due to a collective reliability to a trait or characteristic. Okay, so this has come from the Wikipedia entry. Okay, guys, I'm going to give you some examples according to the article by The Guardian. So already we're starting to not go in such a good direction. Titled European Stereotypes, What Do We Think of Each Other, and Are We Right? The Europe stereotype towards Britain is as drunken, semi-clad hooligans, or else snobbish, stiff-free marketers. I've never even personally heard that, and I'm European. Their view toward France is cowardly, arrogant, chauvinistic, erotomaniacs. Erotic, okay. And they see Germany as uber efficient, diligent, and disciplined. To Europe, Italy is tax dodging, Berlusconi style, Latin lovers and mama's boys, incapable of bravery. Poland is heavy drinking, ultra Catholics with the whim of anti-Semitism, and Spain is macho men with fiery women prone to regular siestas and fiestas. While some countries such as Germany probably own their own stereotypes, others like Spain argue that theirs is a warped view based on experiences while on holiday instead of actually living there, which I guess would make sense. I guess that's technically correct. A Pew Global survey of the European countries, Great Britain, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, Greece, and Poland, and the Czech Republic, found that the European stereotypes found Germany to be both the most hardworking and least corrupt. Greece is the least hardworking, and Italy is the most corrupt. It is also worth noting that 5 out of the 8 countries thought their own country was the most corrupt. Well, that's interesting. Yanko Tabkov has designed many maps which serve as a pictorial representation of such stereotypes, giving an impression of how certain regions of the world may be viewed to others. They have names such as the Arab Winter, the Crystal Ball view of Europe in 2022. Okay, I don't understand that. Validity of stereotypes. Next part. It is sometimes held that such stereotypes often contain grains of truth, which I completely agree with. If you guys have ever heard the slang act like your stereotype, it's because it's like, I wouldn't be able to put a percentage on it with all people at all times, but to me personally, I believe that the stereotype is actually pretty much correct about most peoples and individuals. I mean, it's just a tribes kind of thing, it's groupthink with, if you boil down the 5 personality types, ocean, the openness, I actually can't remember it right now. Anyways, like, to boil down the 5 personality types, I mean, it does make a lot of sense that there would be like a lot of connections in how certain people act based on their race or their sex, and where they're from. I mean, it makes sense. It makes sense to me. So, anyways, it is sometimes held that such stereotypes often contain a grain of truth. However, an extensive study by personality psychologist Robert McCrae of the National Institute of Aging and colleagues found that, in general, they are not trustworthy. An NBC.com article, okay, so NBC, so you have to take this with a grain of salt. Article on the validity of national stereotypes suggests the stereotypes we all know and love, like the French lover and the icy Brit, were mostly created by literature. It explains that, quote unquote, partly because of such dirty books, partly due to French PR, France got the reputation of being sexually free. So that's the end of the quote. And offered evidence to the contrary with a recent survey that showed 76% of the French sometimes suffer from lack of sexual response. Okay. The only thing I really know about France nowadays is the whole, the yellow jacket revolution, like the revolution that's been going on because of the G20 summit. Okay, so anyways, various anti-national phobias and prejudices operate with ethnic stereotypes. Ethnic stereotypes are commonly portrayed in ethnic jokes, some of which some consider to be offensive to varying degrees. Richard M. Steer and Lucaria Nardon, in their book about global economy, used the "you have 2 cows" joke to illustrate the concept of cultural differences. They write that jokes of this kind, so there's 2 examples here, one of Russian. Wait, no, it's 1 joke. Is it 2 jokes? No, it's 1 joke. Okay, Russian company says, "You have 2 cows. You drink some vodka and count them again. You have 5 cows. The Russian mafia shows up and takes however many cows you have." California company, "You have 1,000,000 cows. Most of them are illegals." I'm sorry. Okay, so these are 2 different jokes, are considered funny because they are realistic caricatures of various cultures, and the pervasiveness of such jokes stems from the significant cultural differences. So Steers and Nardon also state that others believe that cultural stereotypes and jokes of this kind must be viewed with caution. Okay, well, I would assume if you're sensitive, sure. Psychological Science Agenda, April 2006. Science Briefs. Rethinking. Sorry about that. Let me go and remove that part. So, this is actually. So, that was the end of the Wikipedia article. Now we're going into the article by Keith B. Maddox, PhD. Acts on these thoughts and feelings in our interactions with members of racial categories. Okay. So this is going to be Racial Categorization by, once again, Keith B. Maddox, PhD. This is the first of 2 articles. Radical categorization reflects the process of placing people into distinct groups based on variation in phenotype or phenotypic physical features of the face and body, such as skin color, hair color, texture, eye shape, nose width, and lip fullness. Racial stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination reflect the human tendencies to conceptualize and value certain configurations of phenotypic features differently, and ask on these thoughts and feelings in our interactions with members of racial categories. Okay, so many of us, particularly students of prejudice, students of prejudice, can recruit from vivid memory vivid examples of racial bias and its consequences. Okay. Okay, doctor, where are you going with this? In both overt and subtle forms. Okay. Stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination exhibit among individuals belonging to different racial categories has long been a significant source of social strife in American society and abroad. In general, the individuals and physical features associated with whites, which would be light skin color, lighter and straighter hair, rounder eyes, narrower nose, thinner lips, are advantages compared to individuals with features associated with racial categories. Okay, next part of the article is rethinking racial bias. Notice that the statement ending the previous section is subtly yet importantly distinct from the statement that whites are advantaged over individuals with other racial categories. It reflects another variety of racial bias that occurs both between and within racial categories by suggesting that individuals may possess features associated with whites and enjoy relatively advantaged status over others without necessarily being categorized as white. At first glance, this concept may be illogical. How can one conceptualize racial bias, characterized by in-between category distinctions that occurs within the racial category? Okay, our impediment may stem from the well-studied tendency to receive or perceive homogeny in the characteristics of a targeted group once categorization has occurred. And the quote here is from Tafel and Wilkes, 1963. In fact, there is as much phenotypic and genotypic variability within human populations associated with racial categories as there is between those categories. This is from the American Association of Physical Anthropologists, 1996. Thus, this bias can be conceptualized as racial because it appears to be based on the phenotypic characteristics we use to categorize others as a function of race. Okay, so basically, to put it in layman's terms, you perceive something when looking at somebody that's a different race, or it's really any race. You look at someone, you immediately can break them down, like in your mind mentally, I guess on a subconscious level. This person's going to act this way because they look like X. Okay, so that's pretty much what this is saying. All right, continuing with the article, this within category variety of racial bias, while perhaps much less familiar to many observers, has consequences paralleling those of traditional racial bias. And traditional is quote unquote. A relatively small but growing literature produced by historical, sociological, medical, anthropological, and psychological researches confirms that racially motivated bias exists not only between members of different racial groups, but also among individuals who belong to the same racial group. Most of the focus has been on perceptions of Black Americans and by blacks and whites as a function of a single feature, which would be the skin tone. Early historical evidence suggests that both blacks and whites exhibit bias based on skin tone as early as the slavery era. And that's a 1945 quote by Drake and Creighton. White European facial features in blacks were seen as evidence of white ancestry, leading to inferences of racial superiority. And that's a quote from 1992 of Wilson, Hall, and Russell. In the post-slavery era, lighter skin provided better social, educational, and economic opportunities. Neal and Wilson, 1989. Sociological evidence collaborates these historical data, suggesting that these social disparities persist among black Americans. And that's a quote from 1991 of Herring and Keith again. Excuse me. Furthermore, medical evidence suggests that darker skin tone is associated with negative health outcomes. And that's from Gleiberman, Hamburg, Frone, Russell, and Cooper of 1995. These disparities are not limited to blacks in the United States. The tendency to make discrimination based on skin tone emerges among Latinos in the United States. And I'm just going to quit saying who mark these and what time period. There's way too many of these. Latinos in the United States and Latin America. Okay. Evidence suggesting that in each of these societies, lighter skin is generally valued over darker skin, and a person's skin tone has been broad implications for his or her relative social status. Okay, yeah, I'm not disagreeing with that. I mean, it definitely depends on, this could be a social, environmental construct too. Like, it just depends on, I guess, what culture, what government, what system are you, in the world. So now I completely understand that. Suggesting, each of these societies, lighter skin. Okay, I just read that. These outcomes are in part due to interpersonal processes that were not generally recognized in social psychological theory. Dominant theories in social psychology have emphasized the role of racial categories. Few considered phenotypic variation within a racial category as a meaningful factor in representations, judgment, and treatment of others. The mainstream perspective asserts that regardless of phenotypic appearance, an individual categorized as a member of a particular group and is potentially subject to the full brunt of associated stereotypes and prejudices. More recent social psychological evidence has linked within race variation of phenotypic appearances of blacks to categorizations and stereotype content. The application of stereotypes and prejudice and implicit and explicit evaluations, this evidence suggests that it would benefit researchers to reconsider the extent to which racial phenotypicality that may elicit categorical thinking and the conditions which categorical thinking may be accompanied by more nuanced patterns of thought and action. Okay. I'm just gonna stop right here to chime in. I personally don't understand this all that well. I do understand that there are limitations on how much you can understand something of. Well, basically, this is, from what I understand from this article, is that this doctor is coming from a universal universal equality mindset, and I'm not necessarily saying that that's either a good thing or a bad thing. It's just, but that is what. That's what I would say would be something that's more of, not a connection, but I'm sorry, I just lost the thought there. Let's just continue. Basically, I'm trying to say universal acceptance of all races, creed, and color for whatever. Just, it is a highly complicated subject, and it's not just because you put everything into this box of universal equality and that we're all supposed to go in this and then everything is just supposed to be fixed. That's from a humanist perspective. Stereotypes of who the person is generally more, to me, more prone to act towards or act out what their race is or their sex is. Like, we're biologically different. So does that excuse quote unquote racism? Well, no, it doesn't excuse it, but let's continue here. Racial phenotypicality bias. Okay, among psychologists, this general phenomenon has been described using a variety of terms: Afrocentric bias, the bleaching syndrome, perpetual prejudice, skin color bias, skin tone bias, subgroup prejudice, and each of these terms reflects differential attitudes, beliefs, treatments of individuals based on variation in phenotypic characteristics of the face traditionally associated with membership, excuse me, membership in particular racial categories. In previous work, so this is the doctor writing this, I have offered a rudimentary model of racial phenotypicality bias, a term that correlates the various terms offered by researchers. Maddox, 2004. Okay, that's the last one we're going to read. The model is guided by evidence of our implicit and explicit sensitivity to variation in racial phenotypic appearance among members of the same racial category. The model incorporates suggested revisions to traditional models of person perception. Okay, so processing begins with identification of the person's physical attributes that act as cues to salient category dimensions such as sex, race, and age. Just one moment. Okay. The nature of feature processing diverges into two routes of information: processing that operates simultaneously and largely independently. The category-based route. The first is a category-based route as proposed by Maddox and Gray, based on traditional approaches to social representation and judgment. Though through this route, processing of the target's phenotypic features results in racial categorization based on a single salient feature or a global assessment of multiple features. Okay, so basically what this means, for example, is say you see say you see a white person with blonde hair, for example. Let's just say that you see that and it's a woman, so you automatically think, oh, she likes to go get, pumpkin spice lattes, and she's rich, and she has a rich father that pays for everything. And like you can break these things down immediately, like psychologically, upon looking at like a person's features immediately. Like even with someone who has maybe, say, for example, like a beat up looking face, you immediately first thought in your head, this guy's a drug addict. So this is what these three people on here in this article are saying. Continuing at this point, the individual may be placed into a relevant subcategory as a function of racial phenotypicality. I don't know if I'm saying this word right. E.g., light-skinned or dark-skinned, depending on the perceiver's conceptual framework. Only salient subcategory representations may guide the process of categorizations. Subcategory use is more or less likely depending on person characteristics or contextual cues present in the judgment context. In that study, the use of skin tones based subcategories of blacks was augmented through manipulation that made salient lean distinctions between light and dark skinned blacks. Once fit between the target and category membership is established, associated stereotypes or prejudices may be used in interpersonal judgments. So pretty much this is just saying the same thing over and over again. So I'm just going to skip. We're going to go to the last two paragraphs because it's pretty much just saying the same thing over and over again. So the last part is why rethink racial bias before we get to article number 2. Okay, this reconceptualization does not maintain that the study of categorical thinking in the domain of race is obsolete. At times, racial categorization may very well override the significance of within category variability. However, there are a number of developing factors in our society that will increase the significance of racial phenotypicality. First is the growing phenotypic diversity among the population attributed to increasing numbers of immigrants of color, as well as increasing rates of interracial marriage and multiracial births. Second is the recent debate over the inclusion of the multiracial category option in the U.S. Census, highlighting the growing recognition that people may appear to belong to a particular racial category, may identify with multiple categories. Okay, so for example, let's see, multiple categories. So let's say if someone is like, say if someone is what's called a half breed or a mixed breed of a guy who is both 50% black and 50% white, because he is in that middle ground of being two races. I mean, I can completely understand that. I'm a mutt. From what I'm aware of, there's about 10 different races of white and Jewish in me. So it's kind of like, well, what category are you supposed to fit into if you're a multiracial person? So it's either you can adopt just being white if you're white and black, or you can adopt being black, and it would be considered either way socially, in general, socially acceptable. Finally, consider the continuing debate surrounding the idea that race is a biological certainty. A growing body of evidence indicates that the biological nature of race is a myth. In fact, racial categories and their apparent correlates arises as a function of social construction processes, which is from the American Anthropological Association and the Physical Anthropologist, 1996. The confluence of these factors suggests that more and more people in the country will not fit into traditional models of racial stereotyping and prejudice, augmented by the deterioration of the traditional framework surrounding race. Okay, I do not agree with that at all. These factors may lead to decreased reliance on race in social perception and judgment, and perhaps an increased reliance on racial phenotype. If we are to recognize the face of stereotyping and prejudice in the future, it is vitally important that researchers give greater consideration to the role of racial phenotype and conceptual knowledge of social judgment. And that's the end of that article. I bet you 100 burpees that the person that wrote that was a white man that has a universalism / liberal mindset. I bet you money. I don't know what this guy looks like. Anyways, let's continue. Negative racial stereotypes and their effects on attitude towards African Americans. Negative racial stereotypes and their effects on attitudes toward African Americans by Laura Green. Why did she write the title twice? Okay, all right. So this is by Laura Green. I do not remember which website I got this from. It was from one of those associations. Okay, anyways. Virginia Commonwealth University. Okay. As human beings, we naturally evaluate everything we come in contact with. We especially try to gain insight and direction from our evaluations of other people. Stereotypes are cognitive structures that contain the perceiver's knowledge, beliefs, and expectations about human groups. Okay. These cognitive constructs are often created out of a kernel of truth and then distorted beyond reality. Okay. Racial stereotypes are constructed beliefs that all members of the same race share given characteristics. These attributed characteristics are usually negative. Okay, so yeah, it's the token term. It's when, I mean, I had a discussion with a woman about 20 years ago because I found out that this person and her family was purposely associating themselves with Nazism, like we're talking about like actual neo-Nazi things, and that whole mindset, I guess, of like, Hitler was her leader kind of thing. Keep in mind, this was like 2006, but so not 20 years ago, like maybe 16 years ago. So, and I asked her, well, why do you hate? She says she hated all black people, like every one of them. And I said, well, why is that? And I remember her saying that she had her house broken into, that's what it was, by a black man who was wearing a mask. So she assumed, low IQ kind of thing, she assumed that, oh, well, because that happened to me and I associate pain and fear with that experience, when I saw that man, she could have just assumed it was a black guy. I don't even think she told me if she even saw the burglar. It's like the equivalent of, like, I don't know, like if you see a Mexican person that breaks into your house, so therefore all Mexicans are thieves. Like, it's a great, I do believe that is a huge stereotype. Like, that's, that one's not debatable. So I guess you could say you could say it's debatable, but I'm just saying that's not exactly, that one's not good optics, I'll put it like that. Okay, anyways, continuing with her article, this paper will identify 7 historical racial stereotypes of African Americans and demonstrate that many of these distorted images still exist in society today. Additionally, strategies for intervention and the implications of this exploration into racial stereotypes will be presented. Description of the problem, first part. Okay, the racial stereotypes of early American history had a significant role in shaping attitudes toward African Americans during that time. Yeah, that one can't argue with, which looks like this woman who wrote this actually does go over the Jim Crow thing. So, okay, images of the Sambo, Jim Crow, the Savage, Mammy, maybe she meant to write Mummy, Aunt Jemima, Sapphire, and Jezebel may not be as powerful today, yet they still are alive. All right. Sambo, first one. I don't even know what Sambo is. One of the most enduring stereotypes in American history is that of the Sambo. 1986, from Boskin, quote, "This pervasive image of a simple-minded, docile black man dates back to at least as far as the colonialization of America. The Sambo stereotype flourished during the reign of slavery in the United States. In fact, the notion of the quote-unquote happy slave is the core of the Sambo caricature. White slave owners molded African-American males as a whole into this image of a jolly, overgrown child who was happy to serve his master. However, the Sambo was seen as naturally lazy and therefore reliant upon his master for direction. In this way, the institution of slavery was justified. This is evidence of the justification of slavery, quote-unquote. They seem a happy race of beings, and if you did not know it, you would never imagine that they were slaves." Okay, that's the end of that quote. However, it was not only slave owners who adopted the Sambo stereotype. Although Sambo was born out of a defense for slavery, it extended far beyond these bounds. It is essential to realize that the vast scope of the stereotype, it was transmitted through music, titles and lyrics, folk sayings, literature, children's stories and games, postcards, restaurant names and menus, and thousands of artifacts. Yeah, I remember actually seeing one of those artifacts. It was like a bugged out Aunt Jemima back when I went up in the middle of the Arizona state one time. Saw that a woman was selling it in her store. It was like an antique or something. It was transmitted through, okay, I already read that part. White women, men, and children across the country embraced the image of the fat, wide-eyed, grinning black man. It was perpetuated over and over, shaping enduring attitudes toward African Americans for centuries. In fact, a stereotype may be so consistently and authoritatively transmitted in each generation from parent to child that it seems almost like it's biological. Okay. Yeah, no, I can completely understand that. There's no way of getting out of that. You can't defend something like that. It's just straight up, ignorance. I remember seeing something from like the 1800s in a newspaper saying that basically black people weren't allowed to what is that? They weren't. These not allowed to, like, these black people didn't even have like a right to live, kind of thing, if they weren't in bondage. So yeah. So, obviously that was pretty twisted. Christopher Columbus, if you look up that guy and read about a broad version of his history, you find out that guy was a savage himself. So it's not like, when I personally don't believe in the Marxist movement of Black Lives Matter, but then when they tore down that Christopher Columbus statue, I really didn't care. It's, I understand it's part of American history, but that's like the equivalent of, putting up a statue of Satan and saying, like, what they did in Nebraska or something a year ago, or might have been this year. No, it's last year. And then, I don't know, people are tearing it down saying, but that's a part of our history. It's like, but it's the devil, I don't know. It's a complicated subject. Anyways, Jim Crow being the next one. The stereotyping of African Americans was brought to the theatrical stage with the advent of the blackface minstrel? That's not minstrel. I don't know what that word is. Beginning in the early 19th century, white performers darkened their faces with burnt cork, painted grotesquely exaggerated white mouths over their own, donned woolly black wigs, and took the stage to entertain society. The character they created was Jim Crow. The city dandy was the northern counterpart of the southern plantation darky, the Sambo. Oh, all right. Performer T.D. Rice is the acknowledged originator, quote unquote, of the American blackface minstress. I can't say that word. Minstrelsy. Continuing this inspiration for the famous minstrel dancing comedy routine was an old crippled black man dressed in rags, whom he saw dancing in the street. During that time, a large prohibited African Americans from dancing because it was said to be crossing your feet against the Lord. Quoted by Hoffman in a 1986 video, quote unquote, as an accommodation to this law, African Americans developed a shuffling dance in which their feet never left the ground. Crossing your feet against the Lord. That's not even in the Bible. Okay, that sounds like some type of Catholic or some type of religious tradition that used Jesus as their poster boy and had nothing to do with Christ or Christianity. That's what that sounds like. All right. Continuing, the physically impaired man Rice saw dancing in his way became the prototype for early, that word again, in 1830 when, quote unquote, Daddy Rice performed the same dance. The effect was electric. While actors throughout the North began performing the Jim Crow to enormous crowds, as noted by the New York newspaper. Entering the theater, we found it crammed from pit to dome. Okay, this popularity continued, and at the height of the minstrel era, the decades preceding and following the Civil War, there were at least 30 full-time blackface minstrel companies performing across the nation. Okay. Yeah, that's, those people, those, just kind of like those Mr. Chan movies my dad used to tell me about. It's with the one guy who would pretend to be afraid of ghosts and he was playing a black stereotype. A lot of these people wanted to do that. Like, they liked being that, so... Okay, anyways, the quote-unquote foppish black caricature Jim Crow became the image of the black man in the mind of the white Western world. This image was even more powerful in the North and West because many people never had come in contact with African American individuals. And this is actually, I'm going to stop it right here. That's actually was talked about in this book I read by I don't know if he's a doctor. His name is Malcolm Gladwell. He wrote David and Goliath, Outliers. I read in one of his books that the reason why a lot of white people are afraid of, not afraid of, no, I guess, afraid of black people, I guess I could use that word just for a substitute in there, is because they don't spend time with them. And you gradually see the more time you spend with other races, the more you feel that you're able to connect with them. And it's that there's just there's not a connection. That's really all that is. You're not connected with that person. So that's really where that ends. That's where that stops. That's the cause for a lot of problems when it comes to, when it comes to racism, I would say. I completely agree with Malcolm Gladwell on that. Anyways, it has been argued that the image of the minstrel clown, so Jim Crow, has been the most persistent and influential image of blacks in American history. Works from the folk song Jim Crow, produced by E. Riley in 1830, further demonstrated the transmission of the stereotype of African Americans in society. Quotes here, I'm not going to say all of it, but this is in quote. This is lyrics from the song of quoted from Bean, 1997, page 11, which is quoted from a song from 1830. I'm a full-blooded N-word, booty, real owed stock, and wide my head and shoulder, I can split a horse block, wheel bout and turn bout, and do just so body time. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. Okay, well, it's incredibly bizarre lyrics. The method of representing African Americans as quote unquote shuffling and drawing, cracking and dancing, wisecracking and high stepping, quote unquote buffoons, evolved over time. Self-effacing African American actors began to play these parts, both on the stage and in movies. Burt Williams was a popular African American artist who performed the stereotype for white society. The response was also widely enthusiastic, as 26 million Americans went to the movies to see Al Johnston and the Jazz Singer. Okay, so that's all that is for Jim Crow. It's very bizarre lyrics. Yeah, that's just, it's in a dark way, it's funny, but but if you really think about it, it's like, putting comedy aside, it's pretty abhorrent and it's pretty disgusting. Like, if you really sit and think about it without, anyways, let's continue here. For this lecture, we got about 18 minutes left, so I don't know if I'm going to get through the whole thing, but let's continue. The Savage is the next part. Movies were and still are a powerful medium for the transmission of these stereotypes. Early silent movies, such as The Wooing and Wedding of a Coon in 1904, The Slave in 1905, sorry, I shouldn't laugh, the Sambo series, 1909 to 1911, and the N-word in 1915 offered existing stereotypes. They seriously named a movie that in 1915 during World War I. Oh my. Offered existing stereotypes through a fascinating new medium. Okay, that's... Alright, let's get back to being serious. The premiere of Birth of a Nation during the Reconstruction period in 1915 marked a change in emphasis from the happy Sambo and the pretentious and inept Jim Crow stereotypes to that of the savage. In this D.W. Griffith film, the Ku Klux Klan tames the terrifying savage African American through lynching. Following emancipation, the image of the threatening brute from the dark continent, quote unquote, was revitalized. Acts of racial violence were justified and encouraged through the emphasis of the stereotype of the savage. The urgent message to whites was, we must put blacks in their place or else. Excuse me. Okay. Well, I mean, I don't know. I don't know, you kind of see it with just, you know, I mean, I wouldn't even really say it's that. It's more of like, it's more of Satanism of, and the worship of other, like the god, the hunter god, the mother goddess, you know, just these high-ranking archdemons. I mean, it says in the book of Ephesians, chapter 10, verse, or that, no, Ephesians chapter 6, verse 10 through 14, that our enemies are not of flesh and blood. So when you see these things, I mean, because you can easily link these things nowadays, and like, let's say 2020, for example, of the whole Marxist Black Lives Matter, quote unquote, movement, and how like all these people are trying to make their own autonomous zones and whatnot. It's just, that's just he's slowly lifting his restraint on evil. And a lot of these people happen to just be, like, when you see the videos, it's black people doing it. Like, I mean, but in half the videos I've also seen white, you know, people you consider use that quote unquote, white trash people, just stuff like that. But it's more of I would say there's a spiritual connection. It's more of like demonic interference, but then it's also sin, environment, you know, the predispositions because of your race, as to, you know, where you're more, there's more possibility you're just going to be a criminal, kind of, you know, just there's so many ins and outs on this. Anyways, let's continue. About the savage, all themes about African Americans began to well up in the face of the perceived threat. Beliefs that blacks were, quote unquote, mentally inferior, physically and culturally unevolved, and ape-like in appearance. Well, none of these people know who Thomas Sowell is, or Jesse Lee Peterson. Anyways, we're supported by prominent white figures like Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, and Thomas Jefferson.